In professional sports, practically all coaches, analysts, and front office executives agree on an unwritten rule without ever having to express it aloud. In a crucial away game, you don't give the keys to a rookie. It's not how professional sports operate to say, "Music, you're making the calls tonight," to someone in their first professional season who has a hostile audience waiting for them to fail and a season's worth of public criticism already resting on their shoulders. It takes years for seasoned players to gain that level of trust. The gradual development of credibility that eventually grants a player the right to be the last person the team listens to when everything is on the line is the foundation of whole careers. Coaches, the league generally acknowledges that it takes years to develop the mental architecture needed to manage a live playoff game at full speed while simultaneously reading personnel, calling plays, and absorbing every adjustment the opposition throws at them. So they shield rookies from that burden, not because they don't believe in them. Nevertheless, Indiana's coaching staff looked at Caitlin Clark and said precisely that when a playoff series against the league's most physical team was on the line in enemy territory, what transpired next was more than just the conclusion of a Rookie of the Year controversy. In the end, 66 out of 67 voters had to admit that it revealed something about Clark. Music is something that the highlight reels, turnover counts, and every sports feature that blended her stats consistently failed to include. The box score never told the whole tale of this season. The pressure was during the decision-making process, was the greatest, and the margin of error had entirely vanished with music. If you've been watching this show for the entire season, you probably already had a suspicion that the plot was more complex than the figures indicated. If you haven't been listening, what you're going to hear will completely change your perception of what Clark truly accomplished this year. Let's go back to a time when none of this made sense. There was a conclusive solution prior to the playoff series, the award vote, and the argument. Let's return to what Caitlin Clark encountered upon joining the WNBA. Because the rest of the story doesn't go as planned if you don't realize the burden she carried from the beginning. Weeks ahead of schedule, arenas that had been operating at half capacity for years were selling out. Not as a result of anything Clark had done in his career. She had yet to play a single minute in the WNBA. The sheer amount of anticipation she brought with her from college was causing the sellouts. Before she ever set foot on a professional court, the league's infrastructure began to change because of such high expectations. Deals for television were being renegotiated. For the first time in years, broadcast partners were paying attention. During that rookie season, she entered every building. It was filled with people who had already determined that this was a moment worth attending, and it seemed like a final setting. There are two sides to that type of situation. It's validation on the one hand. It indicates that others have faith in your work. However, it implies that every error is seen by as many people as possible when it comes to music. In front of a crowd that has already determined that you are supposed to be unique, every poor pass, every misunderstanding, and every instance in which the transition to professional pace hasn't entirely clicked music is scrutinized. Music, there isn't a calm space to work things out. In a partially empty building, there isn't a low-stakes Tuesday night game, where you can work out your kinks without facing any repercussions. Clark didn't understand that. Music, she was scrutinized from her first professional game, something that most veterans never encounter during their careers. Additionally, that shift did not go smoothly in the first few weeks. Music, almost immediately, the turnovers began to mount. Additionally, the number that ultimately surfaced from the regular season was the kind of statistic that appeals to sports reporters. Music, out of all the players in the league, Clark committed 42 more turnovers. Not 5, not 10, not 42. When compared to other people's data, that disparity was so large and visually striking that it almost automatically took center stage in the narrative. Sports programs instantly turned it into a weapon. Each poor pass has its own part. Every error was slowed down, identified, and replayed with a caption that basically questioned whether marketing departments had created the frenzy surrounding Clark instead of earning it on a basketball court. The criticism was loud and persistent and originated from individuals with legitimate platforms. Furthermore, it was difficult to refute the surface-level conclusion based solely on that one figure. More turnovers by an embarrassing margin than any other player in the league. However, this is what each and every one of those segments overlooked. It's also not a small detail. It's the whole idea. Clark was playing fearlessly, which prevented the turnovers. They weren't occurring because she was careless, distracted, or overwhelmed at the time. They occurred as a result of her playing at a pace that her colleagues were still getting used to. There were no conceptual errors in the passes being thrown. Half a second before the play had reached its full potential, these passes were made. Thrown to areas that the defender hadn't fully committed to closing before Clark had recognized them as open. Her teammates were prepared for it at times. Indiana scored after the ball landed precisely where it needed to. They weren't always there yet. A turnover that ended up on a highlight reel with a caption questioning her decision-making was the outcome of the slightly off timing. No one took the time to notice that this is precisely what happens in the early phases of any great point guard's career. On the basketball court, the player with the greatest IQ is often always working a little bit ahead of their teammates. Turnovers are caused by this disparity in processing speed. Additionally, because the decision is made before the traditional interpretation of the play would suggest it's time to make one, it creates the kind of offense that defenses are actually unable to prepare for. There were turnovers with Magic Johnson music. Steve Nash made mistakes. Every guard who has ever played at a speed that continuously defied the expectations of those around them has gone through something similar to what Clark went through in the early going of her rookie campaign. You can make a strong argument against all elite point guards if you focus on their first professional season and use their turnover rate as the main metric for assessing their success. Turnovers don't reveal a player's type. Someone is in every way. They tell you what kind of risks the player is willing to take, how far ahead they're reading the game, and how much confidence they have in their own conception of what is feasible. Athletes who never attempt the throw that opens up a defense are frequently those who never turn the ball over. Even when the timing wasn't right, Clark kept trying those passes. It's not a warning sign. She was worth paying attention to for that reason alone. Additionally, the regular season commentary cycle was not going to be the true measure of what she was capable of. It was occurring in 4 games against Chicago. This story wouldn't be possible without Angel Rhee. Therefore, we must focus on her in real time before moving on to what Clark did in that playoff series. Anyone who claims that the Rookie of the Year contest was determined before those 4 games ever got underway is misrepresenting the events. The argument was genuine. It was very noisy. And the reason for that is Rhee. Rhee was the league's most physically powerful rookie going into 2024. There was also no close second. Analysts were publicly having trouble understanding her presence on the glass, because the data she was displaying didn't seem dissimilar to rookie stats. At one point in the season, there were 12 straight double-doubles. The whole basketball world was watching this stretch. A rebounding record that made league pundits openly wonder if the Rookie of the Year debate even needed to go on at that point, or if Rhee had already resolved the issue with his unquestionable output. She wasn't waiting for chances to present themselves. Through a mix of top athleticism, great positioning, and a competitive intensity that was both impossible to fake and impossible to ignore, she was creating them game after game. In 2024, the Chicago Sky developed their whole corporate identity about what Camila Cardoso, the center, and Rhee could accomplish together in the paint. They had spent the entire season honing a style of play created especially to take advantage of the fact that they were the league's top rebounding team. They used the same strategy for each game, and it worked. Become more active. Manage the boards. Make the opposing team uncomfortable with every possession. Defeat Indiana in particular by winning the war of attrition and allowing the paint to control the perimeter. That tactic had been effective. Each time Indiana attempted to Chicago was there to break the rhythm that had been established. Rhee was bringing Chicago back into the game before Indiana had a chance to recover. Several experts who had begun the season in Clark's corner had publicly switched to Rhee's by the middle of the season. Decisively, without hesitation. It was difficult to dispute the figures Rhee was generating. With respectable arguments being made for both players by experts in the field, the argument had developed into one of the real topics of the WNBA season. Anyone who says differently or maintains that the result was clear before the postseason series is lying about how the season's first half actually played out. re-brought the argument to life. The only true account of what happened is that anyone hoping for a clean Indiana triumph was instantly uneasy with the tone established in the first game of the Indiana-Chicago first-round series. In some areas, Clark was sharp. Music-accurate distance shooting and crisp passing. The kind of playmaking that, in isolated times, made you realize why everyone's expectations of her had been so high. However, every time Indiana seemed to be retreating, turnovers kept the door open. At times, the margin should have been more, but it was just 1 point. Although the word survived does a lot of work in that statement, Indiana did survive. Knowing they had not found a solution, they departed Chicago. Chicago's toughness had become apparent in every possession. A defender wearing a black jersey was always there to hinder Clark's attempts to accelerate the game, slow it down, and make Indiana feel every square inch of the ground they were attempting to cover. The first game was won by Indiana, but it came with an asterisk that said, "This series is far from over." The second game was different in a crucial manner. The highlight play was no longer being forced by Clark. She wasn't searching for the shot that would validate the story or the pass that would wind up on a highlight reel. She was making the appropriate play in response to what the defense was presenting. Basic, uncomplicated basketball that consistently wins games, but doesn't attract individual attention. The outcomes were apparent and instantaneous. Suddenly, teammates who weren't known for their big offensive games appeared to be different players. Chicago's physical strategy was unable to immediately adapt to the ball's rhythmic movement. Indiana triumphed once more. However, the scoreline was not what caught the attention of those who were paying close attention. Music beneath all the commotion, there was a steady, subdued display of basketball intelligence. It was an obvious statement for a rookie who had been publicly chastised for bad decision-making for months. Music Clark's choices in Game 2 were just better. Choices, and the outcome reflected that. Indiana lost the series 2-0. However, since Game 3 was approaching and would completely alter music, no one was listening to soothing music. In this whole music narrative, Game 3 is more important than any other game. Because of what transpired in the last few minutes, not because of how it began. Also because of the lessons Indiana gained from the unexpected collapse that almost cost them the series. In the fourth quarter, Indiana took a 15-point advantage. 15 points in a postseason game when the series is already going their way. The game appeared to be finished. At that time in the fourth quarter, any rational observer would have concluded that Indiana was making progress. Indiana had been the superior team for the majority of the game, but the time was too short and the disparity was too big. However, it didn't end that way. Chicago, under the direction of Angel Rhee, started dismantling the lead by doing things in that building that will be studied for years. Piece by piece. In the game, Rhee finished with 25 points and 16 rebounds. A performance, not just numbers. It's the kind of performance where you can sense a player deciding that the game isn't finished and then forcing that decision on everyone else in the building. Music given the score and the situation, Chicago went on a run that had no business occurring. In those last moments, Indiana had nothing to respond to Rhee. She didn't slow down despite their best efforts. They attempted nothing to halt the bleeding. Indiana still had a shot with 30 seconds remaining to prevail. The play didn't connect in the end. The series is now 2-1 after Chicago's victory. The collapse was not an accident. The cause was immediately determined by Indiana's coach after the game. They quickly stopped playing. The tempo and spacing that had given them an advantage throughout the whole game were abandoned. They stopped trusting the type of play that had put them in that position, were cautious when they had a lead, and began defending the advantage rather than attacking. And Chicago, a club that has been patiently waiting for just such an opportunity, walked Indiana held the door open for them, straight through. That Indiana club had a straightforward and distinct identity. They were almost impossible to stop when they played quickly, moved the ball, and trusted one another. The advantage vanished as soon as they gave up on that in favor of a more cautious strategy and music, and they almost paid for it with an elimination-level collapse in a game they should have won by double digits. The third game's lesson was hard and straightforward. It was impossible to misinterpret music. And the aspect of this story that the general discourse has continuously undervalued is what Indiana's coaching staff chose to do with that lesson heading into Game 4. Music Indiana needed to know exactly who they were and how they were supposed to play going into Game 4. They still possessed a 2-1 series lead Music, but the psychological momentum had changed. Chicago had just shown that no lead was safe, that Ree could dominate games in ways that rendered traditional defensive Music planning useless, and that Indiana became vulnerable in ways that their talent advantage could not automatically overcome the moment they stopped being aggressive. The coaching staff had to decide how to react, and when you think about it long enough to understand what it truly required, the choice they made is remarkable. Music Clark was instructed to lead the offense. In addition to carrying out the plays that came in from the sidelines and serving as a liaison between the coaching staff and the court, you were also responsible for calling plays, assessing the defense, and making choices on Indiana's offensive strategy in real time. The crowd is too loud in Chicago for me to communicate every call from the sideline. You need to be the one making the decisions out there, her coach stated bluntly afterward. While this explanation may seem straightforward and practical at first, it actually signifies something much more important. In a building that had just witnessed their team blow a 15-point lead 3 days prior, Indiana's coaching staff sat down with their first-year player during a crucial away game against the league's most physical club and stated, "We trust you more than we trust the traditional structure." From the standpoint of the coaching staff, consider what that calls for. Not simply faith in Clark's basketball acumen, though that is undoubtedly a contributing factor, but also a readiness to entrust the result of a whole series to someone who has never experienced this. The majority of veterans would feel burdened by that obligation. During warm-ups, the majority of seasoned players would be mentally going through checklists, questioning their readings and wondering if they were accurately assessing the defense when they had to make snap decisions. Music, you don't expect rookies to be able to carry that. According to popular opinion, a person without professional expertise cannot handle the mental processing load in a high-stakes setting. Clark was 22. She had played 1 season in the WNBA. Music, of all the players in the league, she had 42 more turnovers. After considering all of that, the coaching staff concluded that she was the person they most trusted to make the correct decisions when the game was actually happening. The audience was hostile, and there was no room for doubt. Regardless of what transpired afterward, that choice alone reveals more about what Indiana's entire organization truly thought Clark was capable of than any statistic from a normal season. Though it was stated in a different language, the vote they cast in that pregame meeting was equally as important as the later 66-1 vote. Chicago's aggressive performance in Game 4 seemed to be a test of whether Indiana had learned the lesson from Game 3, or if they were going to make the same mistakes in a different musical environment. From the first few minutes, their guard, Lindsay Allen, was on fire. Consecutive baskets in the early going. Before Indiana had a chance to establish anything, Chicago controlled the building's energy and set the pace, forcing Indiana into early timeouts. Music, it briefly resembled the start of Game 3. This is the type of start in which a team either immediately finds its footing or begins a gradual, obvious decline toward losing the game before the first quarter is over. The audience was enjoying it. Everything was in Chicago's favor. Momentum from the Game 3 comeback on home court. A sincere conviction that they had figured out how to destroy Indiana. Music, Indiana managed to stabilize. And as soon as they did, Clark began acting in a way that gradually and eventually drastically altered the entire complexion of what everyone in that building was witnessing. She was not executing a pre-written script. She wasn't waiting for plays to come in from the sidelines and then doing them in a robotic manner. In real time, she was determining who needed the ball, where the defense had left itself vulnerable, and what action would penalize the particular plan Chicago had put in place during that possession. It was happening quickly and accurately. Her choices weren't those of a person going through a procedure. They were the choices made by someone who had completed the procedure before the play had even reached its conclusion. Someone who is working a complete step ahead of the defense in a manner that defenses find nearly impossible to prepare for, since doing so necessitates predicting decisions that have not yet been made. By the time the second half started, her pick-and-roll performance with Aaliyah Boston was practically unstoppable. Throughout the game, Chicago experimented with every possible coverage change. They doubled, switched, hedged, and collapsed. Nothing was consistently effective. The moment between Boston and Clark had evolved into something more than just technical. It becomes extremely challenging to defend music when two players have the kind of chemistry that allows the decision to be made before the play has fully developed and the coverage has fully committed. This is because you cannot defend a decision that was made before you knew you needed to respond to it. Music Chicago's defense was always only a beat behind. Additionally, the entire music game in basketball is a fraction of a beat. The lead increased quietly, possession after possession, rather than sharply or in big swings that instantly won the audience over to Indiana's side. In some respects, it was more difficult to watch from Chicago's bench as Clark and her teammates steadily increased the lead than a spectacular run would have been. Music and intense run provides you with an emotional response. Basketball that is steady, methodical, and patient just wears a team out without eliciting a clear emotional reaction. Chicago continued to fight. Music Indiana was prepared to respond each time they came close enough that the building began to breathe once more. Even with their own team in front of them, the fans in that Chicago arena started to notice something that arenas always do when one side has truly destroyed the other. The ball was moving, the bench was locked in, and the crowd started to register. Even when the scoreboard hasn't fully caught up with the reality on the court, there is a certain sensation that arises in an arena when a game has been decided. The losing squad begins to play in a new way. The motions become more precise. The decision-making process grows increasingly detached from the team's overall music endeavors. Instead of relying on the group, players begin attempting individual plays to generate momentum. They set up on defense with a somewhat different posture than a team that feels the game is still legitimately open, which is evident in their body language between possessions. With a few minutes left, Chicago began exhibiting all those indicators. Music anyone who watched intently could see that the game had already been decided in every significant way, even if the score appeared competitive on the broadcast. Indiana was doing more than just winning. They had disproved Chicago's notion that the result could be changed. And the last few minutes become a formality once a team loses that conviction. Given what had transpired in Game 3 just 72 hours prior, Indiana's lead of 11 at the start of the fourth quarter felt nearly unattainable, and it continued to grow. It was the biggest lead of the series. As the distance grew and remained large, Chicago became irritated. When one team senses the game is slipping away and runs out of appropriate basketball responses, the roughness sometimes escalates in this manner. Every station that covered the game featured flags and replays of a foul on Clark that had no real basketball explanation. Music Clark left it without saying anything, making no gestures toward the officials or voicing any complaints. There was not a single moment of response that Chicago could exploit. She continued to execute. It may not seem important, but that detail is crucial. Indiana had allowed Chicago's physicality to influence their choices in the third game. The tough play and fouls had changed Indiana's perspective on their possessions, caused hesitancy where there had been confidence, and consequently contributed to the collapse that had all but ruined their season. In the fourth game, Clark had made the decision that she would not be affected by anything Chicago accomplished on that floor. Not the hostile crowd, not the harsh fouls, and not the lingering effects of the Game 3 collapse that pervaded all that transpired. In the fourth game, she already knew how the game would conclude. Furthermore, nothing in the building could renegotiate that decision. By the time she finished, she had made 6 three-pointers. Indiana's lead had increased to the point that she was no longer needed, so she left the game while there was still time. As she made her way to the bench during a postseason elimination game in enemy territory, the building, Chicago's building, gave her a standing ovation. In the end, Chicago 81, Indiana 100. Series, Chicago 1, Indiana 3. In the loudest, harshest room at her disposal, Clark had done just what her coaching staff had expected her to accomplish. Clark won 66 out of 67 votes when the Rookie of the Year poll was released. The one expert who had maintained consistency throughout the season in their evaluation of what Reese's production represented cast the lone dissenting vote in favor of Angel Ree. Everybody else had relocated. After the playoff series finished, one pundit who had boldly and openly defended Reese's position at the halfway point of the season reversed his stance in search of an analogy that recognized what had become indisputable. He likened Dennis Rodman to Ree and Michael Jordan to Clark. By no means is this a perfect comparison. Although the details don't map out well, the main idea was evident and crucial. On their own terms, Reese's contributions in 2024 were momentous. Outstanding individual production that was deserving of all the accolades. Additionally, Clark's influence on the game, her team, and the league's overall level of interest, revenue, and attention operated on a tier that was simply distinct in kind rather than merely degree. This is the problem with the 66-1 margin, though. It depicts the result. It does not account for the expense of the result. What it truly required to get there is not revealed. Numbers have the power to make things appear more orderly and inevitable than they actually were. This also applies to the Rookie of the Year vote. The final score, 66 out of 67, seemed authoritative. However, a vote count doesn't fully capture the complexity and humanity of the tale behind that figure. It doesn't go into detail about the 42 turnover narrative that Clark had to maintain during a whole professional season while still performing at his best in the crucial games. Each of those turnovers has its own media cycle. Each and every one of them contributed to a public discourse that continuously questioned whether Caitlin Clark belonged at this level, whether the expectations were reasonable, and whether what everyone had been told about her was genuine or a product. She continued to play her game while taking it all in. She didn't change her approach to safeguard her numbers. She didn't begin using the safe pass to simultaneously manage her public image and turnover rate. Even when the consequences of her belief were being used against her on highlight reels, she continued to play at the tempo she believed in. The physical escalation that grew more intense over the season is not mentioned. As Clark's prominence increased and the importance of her performances increased, rival teams realized that interfering with her, the physicality aimed at her grew because rhythm was more crucial than a traditional defensive stance. Plays that, under other situations, would have prompted quick whistles were permitted to proceed. Music from about the middle of the season onward, Clark's targeting was evident, constant, and present in every game. Music she managed that without ever discussing herself in public or utilizing a microphone to create a victim narrative that would have been simple to create and successful in evoking sympathy. She simply continued to play. It doesn't explain what it costs to be the most scrutinized athlete for a whole season in a professional sports league. Every choice Clark made was examined. Every error was shared on all of the sports coverage platforms. There is a huge push for self-defense in that type of setting. It is not a sign of weakness to have an innate desire to control your image, to be cautious, and to avoid taking a chance that could result in the next big story. It is a human reaction to extreme strain. It didn't seem like Clark ever followed that impulse. Every time a microphone was positioned in front of her, she continued to point the camera back toward the team, play the game she believed in, and take the risks she thought were right. Choosing not to accept credit when you're the league's most talked about player and the media is effectively giving you opportunities to do so on a regular basis is not a simple decision. It's a consistent, thoughtful decision that expresses a quality of character that is truly impossible to quantify through numbers. Angel Ree was a unique player and still is. This must be said unequivocally and plainly, since what she did in 2024 is not diminished by the ROI vote's outcome, and anyone who interprets it as such is misinterpreting the facts. By any honest measure, her season was outstanding. Because of her double-doubles, rebounding records, unwavering physical domination, and intense competitiveness, Chicago was a truly challenging team to play against in any situation. Clark won the prize. Therefore, none of it vanishes. Ree's accomplishments remain unaffected by the final vote count. It simply compares the two performances and recognizes that each had a distinct effect on the league. It is possible for two players to be outstanding in the same season. Music Ree made the 2024 Rookie of the Year argument genuine because her production was the kind that calls for serious participation rather than dismissal. It wasn't incorrect for the analysts to move to her side. They were honestly reacting to real historic figures. Both participants were engaging in actions that were legitimately challenging to assess, which is why the argument took place at the level it did. Same structure. Rhea was using physical power to change games. Through playmaking, basketball IQ, and an almost gravitational pull on those around her, Clark was revolutionizing games. Weighing those factors against one another is difficult. What ultimately proved indisputable was reflected in the vote that was cast. However, the question's difficulty along the road was genuine and justified. What follows is the bigger picture, the one that makes all of this worthwhile after the award season. Since they both come back, they both return. The upcoming season will bring with it a complete year of professional experience, a thorough familiarity with each other's games, a competitive past with real stakes, and a fan audience that has seen enough to comprehend exactly what it's witnessing. Music This Rivalry's first chapter produced basketball that elevated the league as a whole, filled arenas that had been half empty for years, generated broadcast interest that had not been seen in the WNBA in a long time, and concluded with a playoff series that will be studied and talked about for years. If the first chapter yielded all of that, then the second chapter, in which both players are more mature and seasoned and have more to prove, represents something the league hasn't had in a very long time. A rivalry that doesn't require fabrication. A plot that develops on its own because the players and their rivalry are real. Furthermore, there is now no real solution to the question of where it ends. Music When the Chicago audience defended a player on the other team during a postseason elimination game, the argument over the 2024 Rookie of the Year came to an end. Box scores, vote totals, and highlight reels were never able to fully convey what that moment did. It encapsulated the experience of witnessing someone perform a task in a setting intended to make it difficult, music, and doing so in a way that garners admiration even from those who are cheering against them. That's the quality of excellence that shows itself in the most unlikely circumstances. It doesn't request authorization. It doesn't wait for the sound to subside. It simply continues to make the correct choices until the only action available to anyone is to acknowledge what they are witnessing. In the end, 66 out of 67 voters did. The person who is holding out voted for a player who is deserving of victory. Music The True Narrative is just getting started.